Well, tech giant Apple is getting called out for the mounting pile of cash it's storing overseas. U.S. companies on a whole have about $2 trillion in unrepatriated profits, but $200 billion of that is from Apple alone. Apple admits it's not ready to bring the money back home at today's tax rate, and that's prompted some ardent critics to argue that Apple is just dodging taxes altogether. So are they? For more on that, I talked to Max Wolff, chief economist at Manhattan Venture Partners. Here's what he had to say.
Part of what you see with them is sometimes called the Dutch double Irish. And it's true that for a long time, better than 2 decades now, lots of American firms, pharmaceutical and technology firms principally, but many firms have figured out that if they bring their profits earned around the world, and they're truly global businesses, back to the United States, about a third of that revenue, a little more than that, about 35% of that revenue, at least that's the sort of headline rate, would go to the federal government. So they'll go to great lengths to transfer price, to leave the money offshore, and to find ways not to pay that. And recently, Apple's become famous, or Microsoft and Google, a little bit less so, just because the sheer amount of money they're now holding overseas, as this tactic has built up over the years, has become huge, and it's raised the question of, hey, is there a way to get them to bring this money back home to help with the economy and to help sort of reduce budget deficits? Because we're now talking about over $1.3 trillion in toto held by U.S. firms.
Right. And you might not be able to necessarily call it tax dodging. It is within the law to do what they're doing. But what do you make of the outright tax avoidance, if you will? I mean, a lot of critics have said Apple is unpatriotic for not bringing those earnings back home. And CEO Tim Cook recently responded to that claim, telling the Washington Post, quote, "It doesn't go that the more you pay, the more patriotic you are." I mean, do you think Apple should be blamed at all?
Look, Apple's also under a lot of pressure to have and beat quarterly earnings, and this is a way to make sure to keep Wall Street happy. That being said, look, it's obviously better for the U.S. government's coffers if it gets its tax revenue as opposed to not getting the tax revenue. I would say that U.S. law doesn't just allow this, it encourages it. So basically what we've seen these firms do is hold their money offshore, not repatriate their profits, and then borrow in the U.S. at very low interest rates as set by the Federal Reserve, and then deduct the interest on those rates from their taxes. So law here doesn't just say it's okay. Law here basically punishes you for doing what the general public would rather see you do in terms of your taxes. So to be fair to Apple, it might be time for us to sort of put our legislative money where our public mouth is. It's convenient and it's understandable to blame the companies, but you really are blaming companies for doing exactly what the rules you made tell them it's smart to do.
Right. And as you mentioned, the tax rate is at about 35% right now. A lot of people would argue that sounds pretty steep. But give us some perspective. I mean, because some people will say, is it really all that bad? How does it really compare to other countries in the developing world?
Right, so this is really a question of de jure and de facto. So what we have is an overly complicated tax system that most of us detest as individuals because it makes us unsure that we're doing the right thing, and we spend a lot of money, and it's gargantuan in its inefficiency. Well, companies also have this. So the average Fortune 500 company here pays less than half of that. So they pay about 17% in taxes, and many large US companies manage to pay no taxes at all. How? Well, they have armies of accountants. They use the law to the fullest and maximum degree to minimize their tax burden. So the headline, the titular rate, right, the de jure in law rate is 35%. The reality is they pay less than 20, and the reality is we'll probably see at some point at least a tax holiday, i.e. a temporary period where you can bring your money home cheaper, if not a structural reduction. And we have seen some candidates in many elections bring it up. Most recently, the Republican candidate for the president, Donald Trump, saying he wants a 20% overall tax rate or 15%. So clearly that we are seeing discussion of the possibility of dropping the rate.
Yeah, and Tim Cook does say they will repatriate when there is what he considers a fair tax. I mean, what do you think he considers a fair tax? What's the highest tax rate at which you think he would consider bringing that money back home?
Yeah, so look, I think it's a little bit unfortunate when people discuss fairness. Apple's going to think fair is just the lowest possible thing they can get away with, and the tax collectors are going to think fair is the highest number they can get away with. I don't know what fairness has to do with this, but an individual in the United States certainly shouldn't be paying more of his or her hard-earned money in federal taxes than the largest, most profitable company in the history of the world, which is what Apple is. So, some guy teaching middle school softball lessons and biology probably shouldn't pay pay 2 or 3 times the tax rate to support the infrastructure of the United States that a company that makes a couple of $100 billion is paying, right? So I think, who knows? Fair is not something that I can determine economically, but look, paying nothing on the money because it's offshore probably isn't a quote-unquote fully fair contribution, and paying 35%, which is above the average of developing countries, is probably also a bit onerous. So somewhere between the very, very little they're paying now and what the average American pays in his or her salary, somewhere in there probably lies fairness.
Yeah, you're right in saying that the idea of what fairness is completely subjective. And ultimately, I mean, you alluded to this, it will be up to Congress and the president to really bring that tax rate down. How optimistic should Apple really be on that end, given what we know about the policies of both leading presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump?
So on a practical basis, they've come close before. We've seen this discussed many times. Bill Clinton really came closest to doing something about this, and perhaps having his wife in office, if that's what happens, will be beneficial. Trump has a good line on it, but Trump has a somewhat casual on-again, off-again relationship, both with reality and honestness as a rule. So a little hard to know what that means. And his poll numbers are enormously inspiring right now. The truth is, you really need Congress to do it. My guess is that we will see this done, at least the temporary. I'm more optimistic about temporary than permanent, but I think it's going to be massively unpopular with the general public, so I don't think you'd see this really starting to happen in any way until well after the election. After the election, you have a little honeymoon, things like this can go through, but the public won't like the idea of cutting taxes for wealthy companies, so I really don't think we're going to see any discussion of it before November 8th.
When you say temporary, what do you mean? You mean some random amount of months where the tax rate is brought down?
Absolutely. So some kind of holiday, right? So if before January 21st, 2017, U.S. corporations repatriate monies, they can do so at an effective federal one-time rate of, say, 20 to 25%, probably something in that range. And then it goes back, on February 1st, it goes back to the 35 rate. Okay. I do think eventually we're going to see that rate fall to 30 or less, by the way, just because of global competitive pressure.
Okay, so just a little reprieve there, potentially. Over the course of this campaign, Clinton has been very adamant about making corporations pay their fair share, about discouraging corporate inversions, and it seems she was pushed that way even further, having Bernie Sanders in the race. Yet Tim Cook has chosen to throw his support behind Clinton, which I find very interesting. I mean, does he know something we don't?
No, I think probably. Look, if you want to show that you're a modern company and you appeal to a global community, then there aren't a lot of choices of the two here in the election that would do that. I mean, Donald Trump has managed to pretty deeply offend people who are handicapped, people who are Muslim, people who are not American, people who are Mexican, people who are Latino. So we start adding these up, and if you start looking at Apple sales, Apple's growth is overseas, Apple is very international, and going really too far in favor of a very right-wing candidate who's offended most of the world would be very bad business sense. I think Tim Cook and Apple are really good at appealing to the world, and supporting Hillary Clinton is one way to appeal to a broader audience.
And there's also